Story number 1.
I had been looking for a new apartment for weeks. My lease was up, and I was ready for a change, but as time went on, I was starting to feel the pressure. Everything was either too expensive or too far out of the way, and I was running out of options. I wasn't sure what I expected when I first found the listing for the old building on Willow Street, but it seemed like the perfect fit. The ad said it was a two-bedroom apartment, recently renovated, with a reasonable rent and a few amenities. The building was a bit older, but nothing that seemed concerning on the surface. I called the number listed and arranged a viewing for the next day. When I showed up, the building looked even older than I expected. It was a red brick, 4-story structure that seemed to sag under the weight of time. The outside looked tired. Cracked windows, peeling paint, and the smell of mildew creeping from the corners of the entryway. Still, I told myself to keep an open mind. The landlord, a wiry man in his mid-50s with graying hair, greeted me at the front door. "You must be here for the apartment," he said, giving me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, I'm excited to see it," I replied, trying to push past my misgivings. He led me up the stairs, muttering something about the building's history as we climbed. I wasn't listening too closely, but I caught a few words. Quiet building, long-term tenants, and you'll like it here. He led me into the apartment, and immediately I noticed how much warmer it felt than the hallways. The apartment was small but cozy, with hardwood floors and a large window that let in a fair amount of natural light. There was an old wooden bookshelf on the wall, with various books and knickknacks scattered across it, and a faded rug in the living room. The kitchen, though a little dated, had all the essentials, and the bathroom seemed clean enough. "It's not bad," I said, trying to sound optimistic. I was convinced the building was a little on the old side, but it seemed livable. The landlord gave me a tour of the rest of the apartment, and I found myself warming to the idea of moving in. The only thing that struck me as odd was that there were no other tenants in the building that I could see. The hallways were silent. No one was hanging out on the landing, and I didn't see any mail or packages outside doors. He didn't mention anything about the neighbors, but I figured they must have been on vacation or just quiet types. I signed the lease that afternoon and moved in a few days later. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked my things, made some dinner, and went to bed early, feeling a sense of relief. The next morning, however, things started to feel a little off. I woke up to a strange smell, faint but persistent, like something had been burned in the apartment the night before. I checked the stove, the oven, the trash. It all seemed fine. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just the old pipes in the building, and went about my day. That night, when I was settling in to watch a movie, I heard something odd. A faint thudding noise, like something hitting the wall. I looked around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. It wasn't loud enough to be anything to worry about, but it was strange. It started to happen more often, though. The thudding would come from different areas of the apartment, almost like something was trying to get my attention. I thought maybe the building was settling or the neighbors were just moving furniture around. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I tried to ignore it. As the days passed, the noises started to get more frequent and more noticeable. It wasn't just thuds anymore. There were whispers. Soft, almost inaudible voices that seemed to drift through the apartment like someone was speaking just out of earshot. I would sit in the living room trying to focus on my work or a TV show, and I could hear them. Faint conversations, low murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. I started to feel like I was going crazy. I would check the windows to make sure they were shut, double-check the doors, but the whispers persisted. It wasn't a constant thing, but whenever I was in the apartment alone, it would happen. I convinced myself that it was probably the building itself. Old pipes, creaky floors, maybe even the wind. But deep down, I knew there was something unsettling about the apartment. One evening, as I was coming back from work, I noticed something strange outside my door. A pile of old, yellowed newspapers stacked neatly just outside my apartment. I picked them up, curious, but when I glanced at the date, I felt a chill run down my spine. The papers were from the late 1970s. I had no idea how they had gotten there, but I knew one thing for sure. There had been no delivery. I hadn't seen a newspaper in the hallway at all since I moved in. I opened my apartment door and found it cold, the air inside far chillier than the rest of the building. My stomach twisted as I looked around, scanning the room for anything out of place. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was in there with me, someone who had been watching. The whispering had grown louder, more distinct. I could hear words now, though I couldn't make them out. It felt as though something was trying to communicate with me, but I couldn't understand it. I was terrified, but I couldn't leave. I had no family nearby, and I didn't have enough money to move somewhere else just yet. That night, the noises reached a fever pitch. I could hear footsteps pacing back and forth in the hallway, growing louder as they approached my door. My heart began to race. I rushed to the peephole, but when I looked out, the hallway was empty. There was no one there. I bolted the door and tried to go to sleep, but the whispers continued. I heard a voice, distinct this time, right behind me. "Get out!" I froze. The voice wasn't my own, and it was far too close. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I whipped around, but there was no one in the room. I tried to ignore it. I told myself that I was just hearing things, that the stress of moving and settling in was messing with my head. But the whispering coming back, every night, sometimes in the middle of the day, always just beyond my reach. I couldn't escape it. I decided to confront the landlord the next morning. I was shaking as I entered his office and asked if anyone had lived in the apartment before me. He looked at me, his face unreadable. "Why do you ask?" he said. I hesitated, but then explained everything, how I had been hearing whispers, footsteps, and the strange newspapers outside my door. The landlord listened silently, his face pale. "Listen," he said, after a long pause. "You're not the first one to experience this. I thought it was just the old building settling, but, well, you're not the first tenant to feel uncomfortable here. People come and go, some can't stay, and some, well, they disappear." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Disappear?" "People have lived in that apartment before," he continued, looking almost guilty, "but they've never stayed long. There are rumors, strange things happen in that apartment. It's always been that way. I should have told you." I didn't know what to say. The hairs on my neck stood up as I looked around, the air growing heavier. It was as though the building itself was watching me, waiting for me to leave. I moved out the following week. The landlord tried to convince me to stay, but I couldn't. I packed my things and left without looking back, vowing never to return. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that whatever haunted that apartment is still there, waiting for the next tenant. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
It was my first real place after college, and I couldn't have been more excited. After months of house hunting, I found a small one-bedroom apartment on the upper floor of an old building, in a neighborhood just on the edge of the city. The building was old, at least 100 years old, and though the walls were cracked, the paint was peeling, and the windows had a slight draft, it had a character to it that I loved. The rent was low, and the landlord, Mr. Thomas, seemed nice. He was an older man, in his 70s, with white hair and glasses, but he had a warm smile and he seemed eager to get a tenant. After a quick tour, I agreed to sign the lease that afternoon. The apartment was basic, nothing fancy, but it felt like it had potential. It was in need of a little TLC, but that didn't bother me. I was young, starting my career, and I didn't need much. The hardwood floors were a bit scratched, the bathroom was outdated, and the kitchen was cramped, but I could make it work. The apartment felt like a fresh start. The first few weeks went by smoothly. I worked during the day and came home at night to relax. The building itself wasn't noisy, but there were the usual sounds, a creaky floorboard now and then, the soft hum of the old radiators, and the occasional bumping sounds from the neighbors. I didn't mind any of it. I was living on my own, and it felt great. But after a few weeks, I started hearing things. At first, it was subtle, a faint tapping sound coming from the wall that separated my apartment from the unit next door. It didn't bother me at first. I assumed it was the pipes settling or the wind making the old walls creak. But the sound didn't stop. It started to happen every night, around 2 a.m. without fail. The tapping wasn't loud, more like a rhythmic thudding, almost as if someone was lightly knocking on the wall. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured the neighbors next door were making some noise. or maybe it was the building itself settling. I would roll over in bed and pull the covers over my head, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. It only got worse. The tapping started getting louder, more persistent. Sometimes it would sound like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor on the other side of the wall, and always at night, without fail. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I couldn't stand it anymore. I was lying in bed, the sound of the tapping echoing in the quiet of the apartment, when I decided I was going to confront it. I walked out into the hallway and knocked on the door of the apartment next door. It took a few moments for anyone to answer, but when the door opened, it was an older woman who greeted me. She had a warm smile, though her eyes seemed tired. "Hi," I said, feeling awkward. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I've been hearing some strange noises coming from your apartment late at night. It's kind of like tapping or knocking on the wall. I just wanted to check if everything's okay." The woman seemed surprised. "Oh my goodness, I had no idea. I haven't heard anything myself. I'll definitely keep an ear out for it." She thanked me for letting her know, and I went back to my apartment feeling a little embarrassed. Maybe it was just the old building settling. I had made a mountain out of a molehill. But the next night, the noise started again. The tapping was louder this time, and I could even hear something else, like the sound of something scraping along the wall, almost like fingernails dragging slowly across the surface. I didn't know what to do. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. There was no reason for this noise to be happening. I could hear the neighbor's voice through the wall sometimes, but I had never heard anything like this. It was as if someone or something was deliberately making noise to get my attention. The sound continued for weeks, and I was becoming more and more anxious. I couldn't focus at work anymore, and I was barely sleeping. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the apartment. I had no logical explanation for what was happening, but it felt as if something was watching me, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I started doing some research on the building, trying to find some explanation for the noises. There wasn't much online, no reviews, no history of any sort of incidents, but I found the name of the original builder in an old archive. The building had been constructed in the early 1900s, but there was very little information about it after that. No mention of any incidents, no sign of strange happenings. But something didn't sit right with me. I had to know more. One evening, I decided to approach Mr. Thomas, the landlord. I caught him just as he was about to head out for the evening. "Mr. Thomas," I said, feeling nervous. "I've been hearing some strange noises in the apartment. Tapping, scraping. Do you know if anything has ever happened here? Like, is the building haunted or anything like that?" He looked at me, his face shifting slightly. There was something in his expression, an emotion I couldn't place. It was like he was considering something carefully before answering. "Old buildings like this make all sorts of noises," he said finally, his voice low. "It's nothing to worry about." "But have you ever heard anything like this before?" I asked, my voice betraying my nerves. He paused, his gaze drifting toward the old staircase behind him. "Listen, it's probably just the wind or the pipes. Buildings settle, especially one this old." I wasn't convinced. "Okay, but have there been any tenants who—" I stopped myself before I could finish the question. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I was beginning to wonder if I was the only one hearing this. Mr. Thomas looked at me with an unreadable expression. "The building's fine. Just don't pay too much attention to the sounds. It's just part of living in a building like this." That night, the noises were unbearable. The tapping had become louder and more frantic. It felt as though someone was pounding on the walls with their fists. It was no longer a subtle disturbance. It was an undeniable presence that was impossible to ignore. But the worst part was when I heard a voice. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It was faint, a low murmur that seemed to come from the direction of the wall. But then it grew clearer. "Help, help me." The voice was so clear, so real that I froze. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but there was no mistaking the desperation in it. I bolted out of bed and rushed to the wall. I pressed my ear to it, straining to hear any sound that might explain what I had just heard. There was nothing, just the quiet hum of the building. I tried to call Mr. Thomas again, but he didn't answer. I didn't know what to do. The noise was growing louder now, the voice becoming clearer, more frantic. I had to find out what was going on. In a panic, I decided to search the building. I started in the basement, where I thought I might find some explanation for the strange noises. The door to the basement was old and creaky, and when I opened it, a musty smell wafted up. The basement was dimly lit with old boxes piled against the walls, and the floor was covered in dust. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I was determined to find something, anything that could explain the strange happenings in the apartment. And then I saw it. At the far end of the basement, hidden behind a stack of old furniture, was a door, small, weathered, and nearly invisible in the shadows. It looked out of place, as though it didn't belong. It was barely ajar, just enough for me to push it open and step inside. The room was small, dark, and filled with cobwebs, but what caught my attention was the strange symbols scratched into the walls. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw that the marks were not random. They looked like words in a language I didn't recognize. That's when I heard it again, the tapping, the scraping. But this time, it was closer. It was coming from behind the walls, like someone was trying to get out. The voice was louder now, clearer, almost pleading. "Help me, please." I ran back up the stairs, my mind racing. I couldn't stay there any longer. I didn't know what was happening in that building, but I knew I couldn't be a part of it. I packed my things that night and left. I never spoke to Mr. Thomas again. I never went back to that apartment. To this day, I still wonder what happened in that building, what was trying to get my attention. But I never found answers. All I know is that sometimes in the dead of night, I hear the tapping, the scraping, and I know deep down that something is still out there, waiting, watching, and never letting go. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I moved into my first apartment in the fall of 2018. I was fresh out of college and had landed a job in the city. The apartment was small, but it was mine. It was in an older building, the kind you find in neighborhoods that are slowly gentrifying. The rent was affordable, and it was in a decent location, close enough to work, but far enough to avoid the noise and chaos of downtown. The building had character, with old wooden floors that creaked underfoot and antique doors that had been painted over so many times they almost didn't close properly anymore. The elevator was slow, always making strange sounds, and the hallways smelled faintly of old wood and dust, but it felt homey. The landlord, Mr. Harris, was an older man with a bit of a stoop and an unsettlingly calm demeanor. He gave me the key and a brief introduction to the building before heading back to his small office in the basement. "There's nothing to worry about," he said in his deep, gravelly voice. "Most of the tenants are quiet. You'll like it here." I didn't think much of it at the time. He seemed harmless enough, and I was eager to move in. I unpacked my things over the weekend, filled the apartment with the small comforts of home, books, blankets, photos of my family. It felt good to have my own space. The first few weeks went by without incident. The neighbors seemed quiet, just like Mr. Harris had promised. There was Mrs. Stevens on the floor below me, an elderly woman who occasionally knocked on my door to ask if I could help her with small tasks. On the floor above, there was a young couple who worked late hours, so I rarely saw them. The other tenants were either equally as reclusive or hardly ever home. But then, one evening, I began to notice something strange. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint sound coming from the wall behind me. At first, it was subtle, like something was shifting or moving, almost like the house was settling. But then it started again the next night. And the next. It was a soft, dragging sound, like something or someone was scraping the wall from the other side. The noise wasn't loud enough to be alarming, but it was persistent. I tried to brush it off as old building noises or pipes, but after a while, it started to wear on me. One night, the sound was louder than usual. I was lying in bed reading when I heard the unmistakable scraping again, but this time it was accompanied by a low, thudding noise. It was coming from the wall on the other side of the apartment, where Mrs. Stevens' unit was. The thuds sounded like they were hitting something soft, almost like a fist was being pressed into the drywall. I didn't think much of it at first. Mrs. Stevens had mentioned to me a few times that the building was old and that things like this happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the noise. It wasn't random. It seemed almost deliberate, rhythmic, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. The next day, I ran into Mrs. Stevens in the hallway. She was standing by the elevator, holding her cane, and smiled when she saw me. Her smile, though, seemed strained, like she had been carrying a weight on her shoulders. "Hello, dear," she said in her soft voice. "I hope you're not hearing those noises, too?" I froze. "What noises?" "You know," she said, looking down at the floor. "The ones in the walls, the scratching and thudding. It's been happening for years, but no one wants to talk about it." My blood ran cold. "You've been hearing it too?" She nodded slowly, her wrinkled face drawn tight with worry. "I hear it every night, just after midnight. It's been going on for as long as I can remember. The building, it's strange, dear. It's not just the age of it. There's something else." "Something else?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" "I don't know if I should say," she hesitated, glancing around as though she was worried someone might overhear. "But it's not just the walls. There's something in the basement. Mr. Harris doesn't like to talk about it. Neither do the other tenants. But if you listen closely, you'll hear it. Just before it starts in the walls, the basement is where it all begins." I was about to ask her more, but at that moment, the elevator doors opened and Mrs. Stevens hobbled inside, her cane tapping softly against the floor. Before the doors closed, she looked up at me one last time and said, "Just be careful, dear. Don't go down there. Don't go into the basement." I didn't know what to make of it. Was she just an old woman with an overactive imagination, or was there something more to what she was saying? I had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right, and the strange noises in the walls seemed to confirm that gut feeling. Still, I decided to dismiss it. After all, I had only been living there for a short time. Old buildings make strange sounds, right? But that night, the noises returned. The thuds, the scraping. It was all so much louder this time. And it wasn't just in the walls anymore. I could hear someone moving around outside my apartment, in the hallway. I stood frozen in my bed, listening. I could hear the shuffle of footsteps, slow and deliberate, dragging across the floor. The sound came closer and closer to my door, until I was certain that someone was standing right outside. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't bring myself to move. It was as though the air had thickened, and I couldn't breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps stopped. Silence. Absolute suffocating silence. I gathered all my courage and crept to the door, pressing my ear against it. There was nothing. No movement, no sound, nothing. I opened the door just a crack and peeked into the hallway. It was empty. The dim light from the ceiling flickered slightly, casting long shadows down the narrow corridor. I looked toward the staircase, half expecting to see someone there, but again, there was no one. I closed the door quickly and locked it, trying to shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next day, I decided to do something I never thought I would. I went down to the basement. Mr. Harris had told me once that the basement was off limits to tenants unless there was an emergency, but curiosity got the best of me. I needed to know if there was any truth to what Mrs. Stevens had said. What was in that basement? Why did it feel like the building itself was trying to keep something hidden? I walked down the narrow hallway to the basement door, the air growing colder as I approached. The door was made of thick wood, and there was an old-fashioned lock on it. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Should I do this? Was I really going to open the door to whatever was hiding down there? My pulse quickened, but I had to know. I turned the knob. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. The air smelled musty, like old wood and damp stone. I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing against me, but I stepped forward, one foot in front of the other, my breath shallow and quick. The stairs groaned under my weight as I made my way down, and the further I descended, the more oppressive the air became. It felt like something was watching me from the shadows. I reached the bottom of the stairs, and the first thing I noticed was the strange, thick feeling in the air, almost like it was charged with energy. There were boxes piled haphazardly around the room, old furniture covered in dust, and faded paintings hanging crookedly on the walls. It looked like an old storage room, abandoned for years. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the far corner of the room, there was a wooden door, half hidden behind some old furniture. The door looked newer than everything else in the room. It was painted black, with thick iron hinges that gleamed in the dim light. The closer I got, the more I could hear a low, muffled sound, scratching, thudding, almost like something was trapped inside. My heart was in my throat as I reached for the doorknob, but just as my fingers touched the cold metal, I heard a voice. It was faint, but unmistakable. "Get out!" I froze, the words echoing in my head. It wasn't Mrs. Stevens. It wasn't Mr. Harris. The voice came from somewhere deep within the room, from behind the door. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I turned and ran up the stairs, slamming the door behind me, my legs shaking as I reached the top. That night, I packed my things and left. I didn't tell anyone why. I didn't need to. I never went back to that apartment, and I never found out what was in that basement.
Story number 4.
I had always been excited about the idea of living in my own place. After years of sharing dorms and apartments with roommates, I finally found a one-bedroom apartment in a small but cozy building near downtown. It wasn't the nicest place, but it had character. The floors creaked with age, and the smell of old wood and dust filled the air. But to me, it was perfect. It was mine, and I was thrilled to start my new life in the city. The landlord, Mr. Williams, was a quiet man who mostly kept to himself. He was in his late 50s with thinning gray hair and a gentle, distant manner. I met him once when I signed the lease, and he told me about the building's history. It was an old building constructed in the 1930s, and while it had been updated over the years, it still retained much of its original charm. At first, everything seemed fine. My apartment was on the second floor, at the end of the hall. The neighbors were friendly enough, though I rarely saw them. There was Mrs. Nelson, the woman in the unit next door, who was always out on her balcony smoking. Then there was the young couple who lived across the hall. They didn't seem to mind my presence, and I didn't mind theirs. I had the apartment all to myself, and I quickly settled into a comfortable routine. I worked long hours during the day, so most nights I would come home, make dinner, and relax with a book or a movie. But over time, I began to notice things, small things. At first, they were easy to dismiss. The first thing that caught my attention was the strange knocking sounds at night. It started during the second week of my stay. At first, it was subtle, just a light tapping on the walls or the floor. It sounded like someone was knocking on a door or tapping their fingers against the wall. I thought it was just the building settling, or maybe one of the neighbors being a little too loud. But then the knocking grew more frequent. It would start at random times, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning. The sound seemed to come from the walls, the floor, and even the ceiling. I could hear it echoing through the building, soft at first, then louder, almost like it was moving closer to me. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard it again. This time, the knocking was louder, more urgent, as if someone was trying to get my attention. I sat up in bed, listening carefully. The knocking seemed to be coming from the wall beside my bed, just behind the headboard. I froze, holding my breath, trying to make sense of it. There was no one else in the apartment. I knew that. The sound continued, rhythmic and insistent. My heart began to race. I wanted to get up and investigate, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The next day, I ran into Mrs. Nelson in the hallway. She was carrying a basket of laundry and gave me a warm smile when she saw me. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her voice soft and comforting. "I heard you up last night. It sounded like someone was knocking on your door." I looked at her, surprised. "It wasn't the door," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It was the wall, right next to my bed. It sounded like someone was tapping on it." She nodded slowly, as if she knew exactly what I was talking about. "It's been happening for years," she said, lowering her voice. "I've heard it too. At night when everything's quiet. It starts in the walls, then it moves. Sometimes it sounds like footsteps, sometimes like knocking, but it's always there. It's nothing to worry about, dear. Just the house settling. Old houses do that." I didn't know what to think. I had heard rumors from friends about old buildings having their quirks, but I hadn't expected to experience it firsthand. Still, Mrs. Nelson's reassurance gave me some comfort. It wasn't anything supernatural. It was just an old building, and old buildings made noises. But as the days passed, the sounds grew more unsettling. The knocking became louder, more persistent. It wasn't just the walls anymore. Now it was the floor, too. Sometimes, when I was sitting on the couch, I would feel the vibrations under my feet, as if something heavy was moving around in the apartment below me. But when I would check, there was never anyone there. No one in the unit below, no one in the hallway, just the silence, broken only by the occasional tapping or knocking. I started to become paranoid. I would wake up in the middle of the night convinced that someone was in my apartment. I would check every door, every window, every closet, but there was never anyone there. The noises seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. I thought I was losing my mind. Then, one night, it happened. I had just come home from work and was relaxing on the couch, reading a book, when I heard a loud bang from the bedroom. It was the kind of sound that made my heart leap in my chest. I dropped the book and stood up, my body tense with fear. It wasn't the usual knocking this time. This was a sharp, sudden noise, like something had slammed into the wall. I slowly made my way to the bedroom, my footsteps quiet on the old wooden floor. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the doorknob, my breath shallow. I didn't know what I was expecting to find. Something, or someone, standing in the room? A strange figure lurking in the corner? I didn't know, but I had to look. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. There was nothing there. Nothing except the soft, lingering sound of a faint tapping. It was coming from behind the wall again, just like before. I stared at the wall for a moment, feeling a cold chill creep over me. I didn't want to go closer. I didn't want to hear it anymore. But the curiosity gnawed at me. I couldn't leave it alone. I took a step forward and pressed my ear to the wall. The tapping stopped. I pulled away quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt ridiculous, standing there in the middle of the room, staring at the wall as if it were hiding something. But the silence was suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was off about this place. The next morning, I decided to confront Mr. Williams about the noise. I wasn't sure if he'd be helpful or just brush it off, but I needed answers. I took the elevator down to the first floor and knocked on his door. He opened it with a sleepy smile. "Ah, Miss Cooper, what's on your mind?" "I need to ask you something," I said, my voice unsteady. "I've been hearing strange noises in my apartment. There's tapping and knocking at night, like something's moving in the walls. Do you know anything about it?" Mr. Williams stared at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. He didn't seem surprised. "Oh, the noises," he said softly. "Yes, I know about them. They've been here long before I moved in." I blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" "It's the building," he said, his voice low. "This place, it's old. There's a history here. You'll hear the sounds, the tapping, the footsteps. It's just a part of it. Nothing to worry about, really." "But what is it?" I asked, my voice growing more frantic. "What's causing it?" He hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether or not to tell me. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "The building has a history, Miss Cooper. There were people who lived here long before you, people who never left. They say their spirits linger in the walls." I stared at him, my mind racing. "Spirits?" Mr. Williams nodded slowly, his eyes avoiding mine. "Yes, some say they're just echoes of the past, but they're still here, in the building, watching, waiting." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Is that why the building is so strange?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just stared at me, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. "Just be careful," he said finally, his voice serious. "Don't let it get to you. These things, they can start to feel real, but you have to remember, they're just sounds, just echoes." I left his office feeling more confused than ever. Was it really the building settling as Mrs. Nelson had said? Or was there something more to it? Something I wasn't understanding? I don't know how much longer I stayed in that apartment after that conversation. Maybe it was a few weeks, maybe a month. But the sounds didn't stop. The tapping, the thudding, the footsteps in the walls. They kept going, getting louder, more intense, until one night I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bags and left, moving into a different place across town. I didn't look back. To this day, I don't know what was going on in that apartment. Maybe it was just an old building with creaky floors and thin walls, or maybe there was something more to it. But I've never been able to shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was listening, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I was excited when I finally found my first apartment. After years of sharing cramped dorm rooms, I was ready to have my own space. The apartment was small but cozy, located in a rundown building on the outskirts of the city. The rent was cheap, and the landlord, an older man named Mr. Phillips, seemed friendly enough when I met him. He gave me the key and a brief tour of the building before handing over the lease. It was clear that the place was old, decades, maybe even a century, by the creaky floors and the faint smell of mildew in the air, but that didn't bother me. It felt like home, and I was eager to settle in. At first, everything was fine. I spent my evenings unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting used to the quiet. The building wasn't new, but there was a charm to it. The hallway was dimly lit, with wallpaper peeling in places and old paintings hanging crookedly on the walls. I barely saw the other tenants, and when I did, they seemed nice enough. Mrs. Nelson lived across the hall, a quiet woman who always smiled but never really spoke. Down the hall was a couple, the Martins, who were constantly arguing. The rest of the building seemed mostly vacant. One of the first things I noticed was how thin the walls were. I could hear nearly everything: footsteps above me, faint conversations next door, even the creak of the building shifting in the night. It didn't bother me too much at first. After all, it was just part of living in an old building. But then the noises started. At first, it was small things. A tap on the wall in the middle of the night, followed by the sound of something scraping, like fingernails dragging across the plaster. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the building settling, as old buildings tend to do. But the noises didn't stop. They grew louder. The tapping turned into a series of knocks, followed by a strange dragging sound, almost rhythmic, as if someone were moving furniture in the walls. I began to dread going to sleep. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the building groaning around me. The first time I heard a loud bang, it was so startling I jumped out of bed, heart racing. I rushed to the window to see if there was someone outside. There was no one. The street below was empty, the city streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalk. I turned around and looked at my bedroom door, half expecting it to be open. But no, everything was locked, and the silence was deafening again. The next morning, I mentioned the noises to Mr. Phillips when I ran into him in the hallway. "You hear things like that in old buildings," he said with a shrug. "Nothing to worry about. Just the pipes, the wood, the foundation settling." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the noises weren't just from the pipes or the wood. They were too deliberate, too purposeful. Things only got worse as the weeks passed. The knocking would happen at all hours, early in the morning, late at night, sometimes even in the middle of the day when I was home. It sounded like it was coming from behind the walls, but sometimes it seemed to come from the floorboards beneath my feet. I would try to ignore it, chalking it up to old building quirks, but it was impossible to ignore when it started happening in the middle of the night. Then, one evening, something happened that made me realize I was no longer imagining things. I was sitting on the couch, reading a book, when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking down the hallway outside my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. The building had been quiet that day, and I hadn't heard any footsteps in the hallway for hours. I listened closely as the footsteps grew louder, approaching my door. It sounded like someone was walking slowly, deliberately, as though they were making sure I could hear them. I froze. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing. I slowly stood up and moved toward the door, my hand hovering over the knob. The hallway was empty. No one was there. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it. A soft, dragging sound. Like something being dragged across the floor. I couldn't take it anymore. I called Mr. Phillips that night, explaining the situation in a shaky voice. "Mr. Phillips," I said, "there's something going on in the building. I keep hearing these strange noises, knocks, footsteps, dragging sounds, like something is moving in the walls. What's happening?" He sighed on the other end of the line. "I told you, it's just an old building. There's nothing to worry about. If it gets too much for you, maybe you should move to another floor." But I didn't want to move to another floor. I didn't want to feel like I was running away from something I couldn't explain, but I had no other choice. I had to know what was going on. So the next day, I decided to confront the source of the noises myself. I ventured down to the building's basement, a place I had always avoided. The door to the basement was locked, but I had the key from Mr. Phillips. I hesitated for a moment before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The air was damp and the basement was dark. The only light came from a single bulb hanging overhead, casting long shadows across the floor. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, broken appliances, and boxes of forgotten things. But what caught my attention was the strange feeling in the air. It felt thick, as if something was watching me. I walked deeper into the basement, moving past old wooden beams and cracked brick walls. I could hear a faint noise, almost like a whisper, coming from somewhere ahead of me. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing in the silence. And then I found it. There was a small door at the far end of the basement, hidden behind a stack of old furniture. It was just like any other door in the building, wooden, weathered, and worn, but there was something different about this one. It didn't belong. I stood in front of it, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering sound was louder now, as if it were coming from the other side of the door. I reached out and touched the handle. It was cold to the touch, colder than anything else in the basement. I hesitated, but then, with a shaking hand, I turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a small room. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols, scratches, and what looked like old, faded writing. The room was empty, except for an old chair in the center, its wooden frame cracked and broken. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room. That's when I saw it. On the far wall, etched into the stone, was a message. They are here, and they will not leave. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't understand. What did it mean? Who was here? Who would not leave? I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard it again. The dragging sound. This time, it was louder, closer. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, just as it had been when I entered. I ran back upstairs to my apartment, my mind racing with fear and confusion. What had I just discovered? What was going on in that basement? I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The noises in the walls had grown louder again. It felt like they were coming from all directions. Knocking, scraping, dragging. It was as though the building itself was alive, breathing, pulsing with something dark and unnatural. I packed my bags the next morning. I didn't tell Mr. Phillips. I didn't want to hear his excuses anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. As I left the building, I turned one last time to look at it. The building seemed quiet, still, nothing to suggest the terror I had just experienced. But deep down, I knew that something was wrong. Something had been wrong with that building for a long time. I never went back. Story the end.
Story number 6.
I had just moved into a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't anything special, just a one-bedroom unit in a nondescript 4-story building. But after months of searching for a place that wasn't overpriced and had decent enough amenities, it felt like a steal. The rent was low, the building seemed safe, and I was close enough to work that the commute was manageable. The landlord, Mrs. Hayes, was a sweet older woman who lived in the unit right next door to mine. She gave me a brief tour of the apartment before handing me the keys and offering some advice about the building. "Everything's pretty quiet around here," she said with a warm smile. "You might hear the occasional noise, but don't mind it. Old buildings have their quirks, you know? Oh, and don't worry about the basement. It's locked up, and we don't use it anymore." I made a mental note of her words, but I thought little of it. Old buildings often came with creaky floors and odd noises. Nothing to worry about. The first few days were uneventful. I unpacked my boxes, set up my furniture, and began adjusting to the new space. The apartment had that typical musty old building smell, but after a few days I got used to it. The walls were thin, so I could hear the occasional sound of footsteps from the neighbors, but that wasn't unusual. I didn't mind it. It felt more like home. But then, about a week after I moved in, things started to get strange. It began one night when I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep after a long day at work. The building was eerily quiet, which was odd because I usually heard the hum of the neighbor's TV through the walls at night. But tonight, there was nothing. Absolute silence. Then I heard it. At first, it was faint, almost like a distant scraping sound, like nails running across a surface. I froze, straining to hear it more clearly. It was coming from somewhere in the apartment, though it sounded like it was outside my door. The noise wasn't constant, just sporadic. Scrape, 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 followed by silence, then more scraping. I thought it might be an animal or a rodent in the walls, something common in older buildings. But the scraping didn't stop. It seemed deliberate. After a few minutes of trying to ignore it, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, grabbed a flashlight, and cautiously approached the door. I opened it slowly, half expecting to see a rodent or some other mundane cause of the sound. But the hallway outside was empty, and there was no sign of anything unusual. I stood there for a moment, the silence in the hallway almost deafening. I closed the door and locked it, convinced it was just the building's usual creaks and groans. The next night, the noise came again, only this time it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't scraping anymore, but a slow, rhythmic thumping sound. Thump, thump, thump. I jumped out of bed, my heart pounding, and quickly checked the hallway. Nothing. The thumping was coming from below, from the direction of the basement. I had never been down there, and the idea of it being locked made me uneasy. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was the sound of pipes or something mechanical, but the thumping continued every night. Each time it was more persistent, more insistent. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed answers. I walked down the hallway toward the basement door, my nerves on edge. It was old and made of heavy wood, with a rusty padlock on it. Mrs. Hayes had mentioned the basement in passing, but she'd never gone into detail about it. I stood there for a moment, listening to the strange noise from below, wondering if I should go down there and see what it was. That's when I heard a sound from behind me. It was a soft click, like the sound of a door latch being released. I turned quickly, but the hallway was empty. I glanced back at the basement door and thought about the warning Mrs. Hayes had given me. Don't worry about the basement. She hadn't said anything about it being locked for any particular reason, but something about the way she said it made me uneasy. The next morning, I decided to ask Mrs. Hayes about it. I knocked on her door and waited for a moment before she answered with a warm smile. "Good morning, dear. What can I do for you?" "Hey, Mrs. Hayes," I started, trying to sound casual. "I keep hearing these noises at night, scraping, thumping, and I think it's coming from the basement. Is there anything down there? I noticed the door's locked." Her smile faltered for just a second before she quickly recovered. "Oh, it's nothing, really. Just some old equipment left down there. The building's old, and sometimes things make noise. Don't worry about it. It's nothing you need to concern yourself with." She said it so quickly, almost too quickly. Her eyes darted around the hallway as if she was making sure no one else was listening. I pressed her again, feeling more uneasy by the second. "But are you sure there's nothing down there? I just want to know what's causing the noise." Mrs. Hayes hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Listen, dear, I'm sure it's nothing. Just an old building. Some things are better left unexplained." I couldn't help but notice the way she avoided looking me in the eye. Something about her response felt wrong, like she was hiding something. But before I could ask anything else, she quickly changed the subject and assured me that I had nothing to worry about. That night, I decided I would confront whatever was in the basement once and for all. I couldn't get the thumping out of my mind, and I needed to know what was going on. Around midnight, I grabbed a flashlight and went down to the basement. The building was quiet, and the air felt thick with tension. The basement door was still locked, but I noticed something odd. The padlock looked slightly ajar. I had no idea how it happened, but it seemed as though the lock had been tampered with. My pulse quickened as I pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the sound of the rusty hinges. The basement was pitch black, save for the small beam of light from my flashlight. The thumping was louder now, coming from somewhere deep in the basement, echoing off the walls. I took a deep breath and began to descend the stairs, my mind racing. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a narrow hallway lined with old storage shelves and dusty boxes. The thumping noise was almost deafening now, and I followed it down the hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air smelled musty, and I could hear my breath coming in shallow gasps. At the far end of the hall, I saw a door slightly ajar. The thumping was louder than ever now, as if it was coming from inside. I reached for the door handle, and for a moment I considered turning back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was causing the noise. I pushed the door open, and as I did, the thumping stopped. The room was empty, except for a single old chair sitting in the center. A beam of moonlight filtered through a small, cracked window, illuminating the room just enough for me to see the floor. There were strange markings on the ground, long, dark stains that looked like they had been there for years. I stepped closer, my heart racing, and that's when I noticed it. On the far wall, in the faint light, I could make out a shape, something small, something dark. It was a figure, hunched over in the corner, its face hidden by a mess of long, tangled hair. I froze, my body stiff with fear. Suddenly it moved. The figure turned its head slowly, and I saw its face, pale, gaunt, with hollow, vacant eyes. It opened its mouth to speak, but the words were incomprehensible, a low, guttural sound that chilled me to my core. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure stood up, its limbs unnaturally long, and it took a slow, deliberate step toward me. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with terror. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard Mrs. Hayes' voice. "Leave it alone. Leave it alone." I turned to find her standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She rushed toward me, grabbing my arm and pulling me out of the room. "You shouldn't have come down here," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You shouldn't have seen it." I stumbled back up the stairs with her, not daring to look behind me. When we reached the top, she slammed the basement door shut and locked it. "You can't tell anyone," she said in a hushed tone. "You can't ever come back here again. Promise me." I nodded, my mind racing. I didn't know what to think or what I had just seen, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to leave this building. That night, I packed up my things and moved out. I didn't say goodbye to Mrs. Hayes, didn't ask any more questions. I just left, and I never looked back. But every time I close my eyes, I hear that thumping noise, and sometimes I swear I can still see the pale, hollow eyes of the figure watching me from the darkness. Story the end.
Story number 7.
When I first moved into the apartment, I thought I was just starting a new chapter of my life. It was in a quiet neighborhood, close to my office, and at a price I could afford. The building was old, but not in a way that made it feel unsafe. Just the kind of place that felt like it had history. The landlord, Mrs. Garvey, was an elderly woman who gave me a warm smile and a firm handshake when I signed the lease. She was kind, a little too eager to make sure I felt at home. I remember her telling me that the building was full of stories, but not to worry, it was a good place to live. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I'd soon learn that it was a warning I should have taken more seriously. The apartment itself was small but cozy. The hardwood floors creaked as I walked across them, but I didn't mind. It gave the place character. There were only a few neighbors, and most of them kept to themselves, which I liked. There was something peaceful about it. I spent the first week getting settled in, arranging my furniture and unpacking boxes. Everything felt normal, maybe even too normal. The kind of normal that doesn't raise any alarms or questions. The first strange incident happened on the second night. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard a faint tapping. It wasn't very loud, just a soft, rhythmic sound that almost seemed like it was coming from the walls. I rolled over and glanced at the clock, 3:12 a.m. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the old pipes or the building settling. But the tapping continued, getting a little louder, more insistent. My heart started to race, and I lay there in the dark, frozen. I kept waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. It went on for what felt like hours, the tapping growing more erratic as if something or someone was trying to get my attention. I finally pulled the covers over my head and forced myself to sleep, trying to ignore the sound. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. Just the quirks of an old building. I didn't want to overthink it, but the unease lingered in the back of my mind. The tapping continued the following night, but this time it wasn't just tapping. There was a soft scratching sound, like nails scraping against the walls. It started around the same time, 3 a.m., and it was so persistent that I couldn't ignore it. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, and used the flashlight to inspect the apartment. Nothing. There was nothing out of place. The walls were solid, The windows were locked, and there were no signs of any animals or insects that could have made the noise. I even checked the air vents to see if something had gotten stuck, but everything seemed fine. I was starting to feel paranoid, but I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe the building was just settling in a way that I hadn't noticed before. Still, that night, I decided to call Mrs. Garvey and ask if there were any issues with the plumbing or electrical systems that could explain the sounds. Her response was strange, almost too quick. "Don't worry about it," she said. "Old buildings like this, they have their odd noises. It's nothing to be concerned about. Just ignore it." I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was being evasive. I had never heard of anyone being so dismissive about strange noises in their apartment, especially not from a landlord. Days passed, and the noises didn't stop. They seemed to get worse, more intense. The scratching would escalate, and sometimes I would hear a faint whispering sound coming from the walls. It was barely audible, but it was there, like someone was talking just out of earshot. I couldn't make out the words, but it made my skin crawl. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight, my phone, and my keys and ventured down to the basement. I figured if there was something wrong with the building, pipes, animals, whatever, I would find it there. The basement door was old, heavy wood, and it creaked when I opened it. The air was damp and stale, and the light bulb above flickered as I descended into the dark, musty space. The basement was vast, far larger than I had expected. It smelled like mildew, and the walls were lined with shelves and old furniture covered in dusty tarps. I walked through it cautiously, trying to ignore the creeping feeling in my chest. The further I went, the more oppressive the air felt. There was something in the back corner of the basement that caught my eye. A small wooden door that looked almost like a closet, but it seemed out of place. I approached it slowly, my pulse quickening. There were no other doors like it in the basement, and it was completely sealed with what looked like an old padlock. The door itself was made of dark, weathered wood, and the wood around the lock was chipped and splintered. There was something about the door that felt wrong. I leaned in closer and saw something scrawled on the door in faded, chipped paint. It was hard to read at first, but after a moment, I realized it was a single word: leave. My heart dropped into my stomach. I stood there, staring at the door, a feeling of dread washing over me. I couldn't explain it, but everything about this place, the noises, the odd messages, felt like a warning. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I knew I wasn't supposed to be here. I turned and hurried back up the stairs, locking the basement door behind me. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. The noises, the messages, everything felt off. I went to Mrs. Garvey's apartment to tell her I was moving out. When she answered the door, she seemed surprised to see me. "What's the matter, dear?" she asked, her voice too sweet, too rehearsed. "I can't stay here," I said. "There's something wrong with the building. The noises, the basement, it's all too much. I'm leaving." She didn't respond right away. She just stood there, her hands folded in front of her, looking past me as if she was searching for something. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "You can't leave," she said quietly. "You don't understand what you've gotten yourself into." I froze. "What do you mean? What is this place? What's in the basement?" She looked at me for the first time with an expression that seemed almost sad. "It's not just an old building, you know. There are things here, things that have been here long before I was born," she said, her voice trembling. "The building, it has a way of keeping people. Keeping them here. It needs people. The noises you hear, the whispers, they're not just from the walls. They're trying to reach you, trying to pull you in. I've seen it before. People who hear it, they don't leave. They don't leave. They can't leave." My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know if she was telling the truth or if she had lost her mind, but there was something in her eyes that made me believe her. I couldn't stay. I had to get out. "I'm not staying here," I said, my voice shaky. She didn't argue. She just nodded and stepped aside, letting me leave. "I tried to warn you," she whispered, "but it's too late for you now. It already knows you're here." I ran out of the apartment, not looking back. I left the building behind and never went back. I don't know what Mrs. Garvey meant by it or what she knew about the building, but I never wanted to find out. I don't know who if anyone still lives there now, but sometimes late at night I hear tapping on the walls. And I swear, if I listen closely enough, I can hear faint whispers, like something is trying to reach me again. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I moved into the apartment on Fifth Avenue in the winter of 2017. It wasn't my first choice, but it was all I could afford. I'd recently moved to the city from a small town, hoping for a fresh start, a better job, and a life that felt less ordinary. The apartment was located in an older building, one of those tall brick structures that had seen better days. The landlord, a wiry, middle-aged man named Arthur, had shown me the place. He had this slightly disheveled look, but he seemed decent enough. The apartment itself was small, one bedroom, a cramped kitchen, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 80s. The floors creaked underfoot, and the walls were thin enough that you could hear every footstep in the hall. The rent was cheap, especially for the area, but I didn't think too much of it. I was too focused on getting settled into the city life. The first few weeks were uneventful. I worked long hours at a local cafe and spent my nights getting used to the sounds of city life. There were car alarms, the hum of streetlights, and the occasional shout or laughter echoing from the streets below. But the building itself seemed mostly quiet. Most of the neighbors kept to themselves, and I didn't hear much from the apartment next door or from the ones above or below. But that peace was short-lived. About a month after I moved in, I started hearing strange noises. It began on a Tuesday night around 3 a.m. I had just gotten into bed and was scrolling through my phone when I heard what sounded like faint tapping, almost like someone was knocking on my door. I sat up, heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to make of it. I stood up and peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. The hall outside was empty. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling of unease that had crept over me. I returned to bed, convinced it was nothing more than my imagination playing tricks on me. But the tapping continued. Every night at 3 a.m., the same rhythmic knocking would echo through the apartment. It was soft at first, but after a few days, it became louder and more insistent. It felt as though it was coming from inside the walls, like something was trapped behind them. I tried talking to Arthur about it, but he just waved me off. "Old buildings creak and groan," he said with a dismissive chuckle. "Nothing to worry about." His words were meant to reassure me, but they did nothing to calm the growing dread in the pit of my stomach. As the weeks went by, the tapping turned into something more sinister. The noise started to change. It was no longer just tapping, it was dragging, like something heavy being pulled across the floor, scraping against the hardwood. I could hear it at all hours of the day and night. I would be sitting on the couch watching TV when it would start. A low scraping noise, like nails on a chalkboard, coming from above me. I thought I was going insane. I started to wonder if it was just the apartment's old pipes, or maybe rats running through the walls, but then came the whispers. I first heard them when I was alone in my bedroom, sitting at the desk, working on my computer. At first, they were faint, just a few low murmurs that I could barely make out. I assumed it was the sound of my neighbors talking through the walls. But the whispers grew louder each night. I could hear them clearly now, distinct words, but in a language I didn't understand. They sounded like chanting, low, guttural sounds that seemed to vibrate through the walls and into my bones. That's when things started to get really strange. One evening, after a particularly long shift at work, I returned home and immediately noticed something was off. The air in my apartment felt thick, heavy, like it was hard to breathe. I shrugged it off as exhaustion from work. But when I went into the kitchen to make a late-night snack, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a smear of dark, sticky substance on the floor, right in front of the kitchen sink. At first, I thought it might be food or some kind of spill, but when I crouched down to examine it, I realized it was something much worse. It looked like blood. There was no way I could explain it. It wasn't fresh, but it had dried into the wood, staining the floor in a pattern that resembled a handprint. My stomach churned as I backed away from the kitchen, heart pounding. I ran into the hallway and opened the front door to look down at the other apartments. But everything seemed normal. No one was standing in the hall. No one was outside. The apartment next door had its door shut tight, and the lights were off. I was alone. I didn't know what to do. I considered calling Arthur, but I wasn't sure if he'd even believe me. Instead, I wiped up the stain as best I could, using a rag and some cleaner, but it didn't feel like I had cleaned anything. The dark stain lingered like it was embedded into the wood. The whispers continued. The strange noises got louder. Every night, I would lie awake in my bed, listening to the dragging, scraping sounds coming from above. It was as if someone was pacing back and forth in the room above mine, their footsteps echoing through the ceiling, getting closer, then farther away. The whispers would come from the walls, from the corners of the room, from the dark shadows that filled the apartment. But the worst part was when I started seeing things. One night, while I was washing my face in the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of something strange in the mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move behind me, but when I turned around, the room was empty. I chalked it up to being tired, but over the next few days, the occurrences increased. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I glanced back at the mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, just a faint outline, standing behind me in the reflection. I whipped around, but again, no one was there. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I stared into the empty bathroom. By this point, I was barely sleeping. I'd started taking late-night walks just to get away from the apartment, needing the silence and space to breathe. But even then, it wasn't enough. I started to feel like the apartment was alive, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. The worst night came a few weeks later. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sharp pain in my leg. At first, I thought it was a cramp, but when I looked down, I saw deep, red scratches running up my calf, scratches that I hadn't caused. They were raw and angry looking, like something had dragged its fingers across my skin. I didn't know what to think. I panicked, convinced that something in the apartment was trying to hurt me. I rushed to the landlord's office the next morning, telling him everything that had been happening, about the noises, the whispers, the bloodstains, and the scratches. He listened in silence, his face pale. "I didn't want to scare you," he said finally, "but you're not the first person to experience this." He told me that the building had a dark history, something he had neglected to mention when I signed the lease. Several years ago, there had been an incident in the apartment above mine. A man had gone missing, and the police had never been able to find him. The rumors were that he had been trapped in the building for weeks, his body left to decompose in the walls. Others had come and gone after him, but none of them stayed long enough to uncover the truth. Arthur looked at me, his eyes full of sympathy. "I should have told you sooner," he said quietly, "but no one ever really stays here long enough to ask questions." That was it. That was when I knew I had to leave. I packed my things that afternoon, never once looking back at the apartment. The landlord tried to stop me, but I couldn't stay. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. I never returned to that building. I found a new place, one that felt far safer and quieter, but to this day I can't shake the memories of that apartment. Every now and then I hear a tapping sound in the middle of the night, and it takes everything I have not to panic. I hope no one else ever has to live there. Story the end.
Story number 9.
I had always dreamed of living on my own, and when the opportunity finally came, I was beyond excited. The apartment I found wasn't anything luxurious, but it was exactly what I was looking for. It was a small one-bedroom unit in an old brick building on the edge of the city. The neighborhood wasn't the best, but it wasn't the worst either, and it was affordable. The landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Finch, was warm and welcoming. She gave me the keys to the apartment and gave me a brief tour of the building. Everything seemed normal enough. Nothing too fancy, but it felt like home. The first few days were blissfully quiet. I moved in, unpacked my things, and settled into the routine of living alone. The apartment had a certain charm. Creaky floors, a small kitchen with old-fashioned appliances, and a view of the street from the small living room window. I liked it, and I felt lucky to have found a place I could afford. However, on the fourth night after I moved in, things took an unexpected turn. It started late, around 11 p.m., when I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep. I heard a faint noise from the hallway outside my door. It sounded like a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking on the wall or tapping on the floor with their fingers. I assumed it was just the sounds of an old building settling, but the noise persisted for longer than I thought was normal. It was almost as if it was following a pattern, growing louder and then softer, only to start again. I got up to check, but when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. Nothing seemed out of place. I closed the door, brushed it off, and tried to go back to sleep. But then it happened again the next night. The tapping was louder now, and I could swear it was coming from the other side of the wall. I lived on the second floor, and the wall I was hearing the noise from was shared with the apartment next door. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. The rhythm of the tapping became unnerving, like someone was trying to get my attention. I even considered knocking on the neighbor's door, but when I checked the time, it was already 1 a.m. and I didn't want to bother anyone. The following night, I couldn't sleep. The noise was back. This time it sounded like scratching, like something was dragging its nails across the wall. I lay frozen in my bed, trying to convince myself that it was just a rodent or a pipe expanding. But it didn't stop. It continued through the night, getting louder and more persistent as the hours passed. By now, I was starting to feel paranoid. Was I imagining things? Was I hearing something that wasn't really there? I wasn't sure anymore. The next morning, I decided to confront my neighbor. I knocked on their door, hoping to finally get some answers. After a moment, a man in his mid-30s opened the door. He had a disheveled look to him, and his eyes were red, like he hadn't slept in days. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice sounding tired. "Hey, I live next door," I said, trying to sound casual. "I've been hearing some strange noises coming from the wall between our apartments at night. It sounds like scratching or tapping. I was just wondering if you've noticed anything weird." The man blinked, clearly caught off guard by my question. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he spoke in a low voice. "You're not the first one to ask about it," he said, glancing around like he was making sure no one was listening. "But I don't think it's just the walls. Some nights I hear the same thing. Tapping, scratching. It's like someone's trying to get in." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean someone's trying to get in?" He looked at me with wide eyes. "I don't know. It's been going on for a while. A few other tenants have heard it too, but no one talks about it. They all think it's just the building, but I don't know. I can't explain it." I stood there, stunned. "What do you think it is?" He shook his head. "I'm not sure, but I don't think it's just the pipes or the walls. Something's off." I didn't know what to say after that. I had never felt so uneasy in my life. When I left his apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. What had he meant by someone's trying to get in? I didn't want to believe it, but his words stuck with me. That night, I stayed up late, unable to sleep. The scratching and tapping continued, but now it sounded different. Closer, as if it was coming from just behind the walls. I grabbed my phone, and in the dim light of my bedroom, I recorded the sound. I didn't know why, but I felt like I needed proof, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it again. The noise persisted for hours, but I eventually drifted off to sleep, exhausted and scared. The next day, I decided to do some research. I started asking around about the building, trying to learn more about its history. Mrs. Finch wasn't around when I went to the front office, but the receptionist was a young woman who had been working there for a few months. I asked her if she knew anything about the building's history or if there had been any strange occurrences. At first, she hesitated, looking uncomfortable, but then she leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "People have said that this place is haunted," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone would overhear. "But no one really talks about it. You might want to talk to Mrs. Finch about it. She's been here for years. She knows more than anyone." I didn't know what to think. I had heard rumors about haunted buildings before, but I never took them seriously. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The strange noises, the way the building felt, the way the air felt heavier at night. It was all connected. That evening, I decided to confront Mrs. Finch. I went to her apartment and knocked on the door. She answered, as always, with a warm smile, but there was something different in her eyes this time, something darker. "Is everything all right, dear?" she asked sweetly. I didn't waste any time. Mrs. Finch, I've been hearing some strange noises in my apartment. I spoke to my neighbor, and he said he's heard them too. He mentioned something about the building being haunted. What do you know about it? Her smile faltered, and she looked away for a moment. It's true that this building has a history, she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking to herself. There are stories that go back many years. People have heard strange things, seen things, but no one really talks about it. Some things are better left forgotten. I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of stories? Mrs. Finch sighed deeply. There were people who lived here long before you. Some of them, they disappeared. No one knows where they went, but people say that the building has a way of holding on to them. Some nights you can hear them. Their whispers in the walls, scratching, trying to get out. The ones who heard the noise and went looking, they never came back. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. What do you mean? You're saying there's something in the building? She looked at me, her eyes heavy with something that resembled pity. You've heard it too, haven't you? The scratching, the tapping. That's the sound of the ones who are trapped. They want to get out, but the building won't let them. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave right then and never look back, but I couldn't. I couldn't leave without understanding. I don't know what's going on here, I said, but I need to know what happened to the others, the ones who disappeared. Mrs. Finch's face grew pale. You don't want to know. Trust me, some things are better left alone. The building has a way of pulling people in. Once it knows you can hear it, it doesn't let go. I didn't sleep that night. The noises grew louder, and this time they sounded like whispers. The voices were too faint to make out, but I could feel their presence in the room with me. I could feel them just behind the walls, waiting. The next morning I packed my things. I couldn't stay in that apartment another night. The scratching, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. It was too much. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I could have sworn I heard something faintly behind me, something tapping against the walls. I didn't look back. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I moved into my apartment on Maple Street during the fall of 2018. I had just gotten a new job in the city, and I was eager to start fresh in an apartment of my own. The apartment itself wasn't much to look at, but it was affordable and in a decent location, not too far from work, and it was all I could afford at the time. It was an older building, built in the 1950s, with a faded red brick exterior and narrow hallways that smelled of stale air and old carpet. The landlord, Mrs. Williams, was a short woman in her 60s, who had lived in the building for decades. She seemed harmless enough, but there was something off about her. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but she gave me an unsettling feeling. When I first moved in, everything seemed fine. The apartment was small, one bedroom, a living room, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. The walls were thin, and the floors creaked when I walked. But the rent was cheap, and it was better than anything else I could find. The first few weeks were uneventful. I unpacked my things, settled into my new routine, and spent my evenings reading, cooking, or watching TV. But as the days went on, I began to notice things that made me uneasy. It started with the little things, strange sounds in the night. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but it seemed to happen at odd hours. There was the sound of footsteps in the hallway late at night, soft, shuffling footsteps that would stop right outside my door. When I opened the door, the hallway was always empty. I would stand there for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, before closing the door and returning to whatever I had been doing. I didn't mention it to anyone at first. I chalked it up to being new to the building, and maybe I was just overthinking things. But the strange occurrences kept happening. Some nights I would wake up to the sound of scratching, like something was scraping against the walls. I tried to ignore it, but it wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a regular occurrence. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from the walls behind my bed, and sometimes it came from the ceiling. It was unsettling, but I kept telling myself that old buildings make weird noises. But then the dreams started. It was always the same, dark, foggy, and cold. I would find myself standing in the hallway of the building in front of an apartment door that was slightly ajar. I could never see the apartment's number, but I knew it was mine. The door would creak open, and I would step inside only to find that the apartment was not my own. It was empty, but there was a heavy, oppressive atmosphere in the air. The furniture was overturned, the windows boarded up, and the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize. I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, but no matter how hard I tried to shake the dream off, it would come back again the next night. I decided to bring it up to Mrs. Williams, hoping she could give me some insight. She had lived in the building for so long, surely she knew something. When I knocked on her door, she answered with a tight smile, her eyes flickering as she took me in. I explained to her that I had been hearing strange noises and having these recurring nightmares, and I asked if she had any idea what might be going on. Her expression shifted, just for a moment, and I caught a flicker of something dark in her eyes. "You're not the first to have dreams like that," she said softly, almost too softly. "Many tenants have had them over the years. The building has a long history." I pressed her for more information, but she just shook her head. "It's probably nothing," she said. "You're just adjusting to the city. The sounds are just from the building settling. As for the dreams, it's just stress. Don't let it bother you." But her words didn't sit right with me. There was something in the way she said it, as though she was trying to keep me from asking further questions. That night, I couldn't sleep. The scratching noises were louder than ever, like something or someone was moving behind the walls. I tried to ignore it, but the anxiety was eating away at me. I got up and walked through the apartment, checking the windows, the doors, the closets. Everything was fine. The apartment was still, as I had left it. As I turned to go back to bed, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the end of the hallway. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring into the darkness. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was watching me. I took a few steps forward, my pulse racing, but when I turned on the hallway light, the figure was gone. I searched the hallway, but there was nothing there, just the same old creaky floorboards and peeling wallpaper. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I rushed back to my bedroom, locking the door behind me, and tried to sleep, but it was impossible. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion. The noises continued, and the dreams became more vivid. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the same vision of the dark apartment hallway flashing in my mind. But the worst part was the feeling of someone being in the apartment with me. I started to notice small things out of place. A chair moved slightly away from the table. A book that I hadn't touched was lying open on the couch. It wasn't enough to make me think someone was in the apartment physically, but it felt like something was playing with my mind. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find the door slightly ajar. My stomach sank. I knew I had locked it before I left. I pushed the door open slowly, the creaking of the hinges making my skin crawl. The apartment was dark, but I could hear something. Soft breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from the bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest as I tiptoed down the hallway. When I reached the bedroom, the door was wide open. The room was empty, but the feeling in the air was thick, like something had just been there, watching me. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. Something wasn't right in that apartment. I spent the next few nights researching the history of the building. There wasn't much to find. No stories of murders or deaths, just the usual records of tenants coming and going. But then I found something in a small article buried in an old newspaper from the 1970s. It mentioned an incident where a tenant had gone missing, a young woman named Caroline Matthews who had lived in the apartment I now occupied. She was never found, and the case was eventually closed, though rumors of strange happenings in the building persisted. The article gave me chills. I couldn't help but wonder if her spirit was somehow trapped in the apartment, tormenting those who came after her. That night, I decided to confront Mrs. Williams. I had to know more. I knocked on her door again, and when she opened it, I wasted no time. "What happened to Caroline Matthews?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mrs. Williams's face grew pale, and she stepped back, her hand clutching the doorframe as if trying to keep herself steady. "You shouldn't ask about that," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not something you need to know. Just forget about it." But I couldn't forget. I pressed her again, demanding answers, but she refused to say more. "You don't know what you're asking," she whispered. "You don't know what's been unleashed." I left her apartment that night, more terrified than ever. The next few days were a blur of fear and uncertainty. The noises grew louder, the scratching, the whispers, and the heavy footsteps in the hallway, and the dreams. The dreams became worse, more vivid. I would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, only to find that I wasn't alone. One night, the door to my bedroom opened by itself. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things, grabbed what I could, and left. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. To this day, I don't know what happened in that building. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was real. And I'm never going back. Story, the end.
Story number 11.
The first few months in my new apartment were almost idyllic. I had recently moved to the city after landing a new job, and the apartment was a perfect little nest, just the right size, in a quiet building, and at a rent I could afford. The location was ideal, close enough to the city center to enjoy the nightlife, but far enough to avoid the chaos. The building itself was older but well-maintained. There were only 4 apartments, including mine, and the landlord, a kind man in his 60s named Mr. Jacobs, lived in the basement. I thought it would be easy to settle in and make this place home. The apartment was on the top floor, a 2-bedroom unit with high ceilings, large windows that let in plenty of light, and a creaky wooden floor that I grew fond of. The first night I stayed there, I remember lying in bed, listening to the quiet of the building, the wind rustling the trees outside, and the faint hum of distant traffic. It felt peaceful, too peaceful. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The neighbors were quiet, and I didn't see anyone much during the day. The first few weeks passed in a blur of work and settling in, but then things began to change. The first odd incident occurred one evening after I had been living there for about a month. I had just gotten home from work, and it was a quiet night. No plans, just a night in to relax. I was making dinner in the kitchen when I heard a strange sound coming from behind the wall. It was a low thudding noise, like something was being knocked against it repeatedly. I stopped what I was doing and listened. The sound seemed to be coming from the space between my apartment and the one next door, where a middle-aged woman named Karen lived. I thought it was just the pipes. Buildings like this one have quirks, I reasoned. Old pipes, wooden beams settling, no big deal, but the sound persisted. Thud, thud, thud. I tried to ignore it, but it was something unnerving about it. It wasn't just the noise itself, it was the way it sounded. It was rhythmic, almost deliberate. It felt like someone was trying to get my attention. After about 20 minutes, it stopped. I figured it was just the house settling and went on with my evening, but the noise continued for the next several nights. I could hear it every time I was in the kitchen, like it was trying to drive me mad. Curiosity got the better of me, and one evening I decided to investigate. I knocked on Karen's door to ask if she had heard anything unusual. She answered quickly, and her face was pale, almost like she'd been expecting me. She was a little older than I had initially thought, maybe in her late 40s, and had a sharp, anxious look in her eyes. "Hello?" she said, sounding almost breathless. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you," I said, feeling awkward. "I was wondering if you've heard any strange noises in the walls. I've been hearing this thudding sound, and I wasn't sure if it was something on your side or just the building." Her face went blank for a moment, and then she quickly looked around, as if making sure no one else was listening. She stepped back from the door and motioned for me to come inside. "Please, come in," she said, her voice tight. "I need to tell you something." I followed her into the apartment, which was sparsely furnished. The curtains were drawn tight, and the air had a musty quality to it. She led me into the living room and motioned for me to sit on the couch. "I've been hearing those noises too," she said, sitting down across from me. "At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but then it started to get more intense. It happens every night, usually around the same time, between 9 and 10 p.m. Sometimes it's a thud, like you said, but other times it's scratching, like something is clawing at the wall." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "Scratching?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Yes, she whispered. I've heard it. It's like something is trying to get in. It comes from the walls between our apartments. It's not natural. I don't know how to explain it. I sat there in stunned silence. This was starting to sound less like a coincidence and more like something else, something I couldn't explain. I've been hearing it for weeks now, Karen continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I even went to Mr. Jacobs about it. He told me the building was old, that it had its quirks, and that I shouldn't worry. But the noises keep getting worse. I can't sleep because of them. I felt my heart begin to race. Have you tried calling anyone? A professional, maybe? Karen shook her head, looking down. I don't think there's anyone who can help. I've lived here for years and nothing like this has ever happened before. But lately it feels like something is watching me and I don't know how to stop it. I could see the fear in her eyes. She wasn't just worried about the noise, she was terrified. And I couldn't help but feel the same way. I'll keep an eye out, I said, trying to reassure her, though I wasn't sure who was reassuring whom. But if you need anything, just let me know. I left her apartment that night with a heavy feeling in my chest. It was clear that she wasn't lying. There was something in the walls of this building, something that neither she nor I could explain. The question was, what was it? For the next few nights, I tried to be vigilant, but the noise continued. I set my alarm to go off every hour, just in case I fell asleep, so I wouldn't miss it. The scratching, the thudding, it never stopped. And every time I heard it, I felt more and more unsettled. It was like the building was alive, trying to communicate with us. One evening, around 9 p.m., I decided to do something about it. I couldn't live like this anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and, without telling anyone, went to the basement to speak with Mr. Jacobs. I figured that if anyone knew what was going on, it would be him. When I arrived at the basement door, I hesitated. There was a thick, musty smell in the air, and the door seemed heavier than usual. I knocked softly and waited for Mr. Jacobs to answer. After a long moment, I heard shuffling from the other side, and then the door creaked open. "Hello, Mr. Jacobs," I said, trying to sound as calm as possible. "I was hoping to talk to you about something strange going on in the building." He eyed me warily, but then motioned for me to come in. "What's the matter?" he asked, his voice low. "I've been hearing some weird noises in my apartment, scratching and thudding sounds," I said, my voice growing more nervous with each word. "I went to talk to Karen, and she's been hearing the same thing. It's driving us both crazy. I was wondering if you knew anything about it." Mr. Jacob stood still for a moment, his face unreadable. Then, without saying a word, he walked to the back of the basement and returned with a dusty old notebook. He opened it slowly, flipping through the pages until he reached a section near the middle. He cleared his throat before speaking. "This building has a history," he said, his voice shaky. "It wasn't always this quiet, you know. There were other people who lived here before you, and some of them, they didn't leave." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean, they didn't leave?" "Some of them disappeared," he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "The thudding, the scratching, it's the sound of them trying to get out. People who lived here, they heard the same noises. Some of them tried to get help, but others just vanished." I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he was saying. "What are you talking about? Who disappeared?" He looked up at me, his face pale and grave. "You need to leave this place. If you're hearing the noises, it's already too late." I didn't understand, but I didn't need to. His words were enough to send me running. I turned and bolted for the door, not looking back until I was outside, gasping for air. My heart was racing, and I had the overwhelming feeling that I had narrowly escaped something I couldn't even begin to understand. That night, I didn't sleep. I packed my things and left, abandoning my apartment and everything I had worked so hard to build. I couldn't stay there. Not with the noises, not with the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make the same mistake the others had. I haven't looked back since. I don't know what happened to Karen or Mr. Jacobs. I don't know what it was in that building, but I do know one thing for certain. There's something about old buildings, something about the stories they carry that can never truly be forgotten. And sometimes those stories don't stay buried. Story the end.
Story number 12.
I moved into my apartment on Maple Street during the fall of 2018. I had just gotten a new job in the city, and I was eager to start fresh in an apartment of my own. The apartment itself wasn't much to look at, but it was affordable and in a decent location, not too far from work, and it was all I could afford at the time. It was an older building built in the 1950s with a faded red brick exterior and narrow hallways that smelled of stale air and old carpet. The landlord, Mrs. Williams, was a short woman in her 60s who had lived in the building for decades. She seemed harmless enough, but there was something off about her. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but she gave me an unsettling feeling. When I first moved in, everything seemed fine. The apartment was small, one bedroom, a living room, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. The walls were thin and the floors creaked when I walked, but the rent was cheap and it was better than anything else I could find. The first few weeks were uneventful. I unpacked my things, settled into my new routine, and spent my evenings reading, cooking, or watching TV. But as the days went on, I began to notice things that made me uneasy. It started with the little things, strange sounds in the night. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but it seemed to happen at odd hours. There was the sound of footsteps in the hallway late at night, soft, shuffling footsteps that would stop right outside my door. When I opened the door, the hallway was always empty. I would stand there for a moment, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, before closing the door and returning to whatever I had been doing. I didn't mention it to anyone at first. I chalked it up to being new to the building, and maybe I was just overthinking things. But the strange occurrences kept happening. Some nights, I would wake up to the sound of scratching, like something was scraping against the walls. I tried to ignore it, but it wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a regular occurrence. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from the walls behind my bed, and sometimes it came from the ceiling. It was unsettling, but I kept telling myself that old buildings make weird noises. But then the dreams started. It was always the same, dark, foggy, and cold. I would find myself standing in the hallway of the building, in front of an apartment door that was slightly ajar. I could never see the apartment's number, but I knew it was mine. The door would creak open, and I would step inside, only to find that the apartment was not my own. It was empty, but there was a heavy, oppressive atmosphere in the air. The furniture was overturned, the windows boarded up, and the walls were covered in strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize. I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, but no matter how hard I tried to shake the dream off, it would come back again the next night. I decided to bring it up to Mrs. Williams, hoping she could give me some insight. She had lived in the building for so long, surely she knew something. When I knocked on her door, she answered with a tight smile, her eyes flickering as she took me in. I explained to her that I had been hearing strange noises and having these recurring nightmares, and I asked if she had any idea what might be going on. Her expression shifted, just for a moment, and I caught a flicker of something dark in her eyes. "You're not the first to have dreams like that," she said softly, almost too softly. "Many tenants have had them over the years. The building has a long history." I pressed her for more information, but she just shook her head. "It's probably nothing," she said. "You're just adjusting to the city. The sounds are just from the building settling. As for the dreams, it's just stress. Don't let it bother you." But her words didn't sit right with me. There was something in the way she said it, as though she was trying to keep me from asking further questions. That night, I couldn't sleep. The scratching noises were louder than ever, like something or someone was moving behind the walls. I tried to ignore it, but the anxiety was eating away at me. I got up and walked through the apartment, checking the windows, the doors, the closets. Everything was fine. The apartment was still as I had left it. As I turned to go back to bed, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the end of the hallway. My heart skipped a beat and I froze, staring into the darkness. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence like it was watching me. I took a few steps forward, my pulse racing, but when I turned on the hallway light, the figure was gone. I searched the hallway, but there was nothing there. Just the same old creaky floorboards and peeling wallpaper. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I rushed back to my bedroom, locking the door behind me, and tried to sleep, but it was impossible. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion. The noises continued, and the dreams became more vivid. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the same vision of the dark apartment hallway flashing in my mind. But the worst part was the feeling of someone being in the apartment with me. I started to notice small things out of place. A chair moved slightly away from the table. A book that I hadn't touched was lying open on the couch. It wasn't enough to make me think someone was in the apartment physically, but it felt like something was playing with my mind. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find the door slightly ajar. My stomach sank. I knew I had locked it before I left. I pushed the door open slowly, the creaking of the hinges making my skin crawl. The apartment was dark, but I could hear something, soft breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from the bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest as I tiptoed down the hallway. When I reached the bedroom, the door was wide open. The room was empty, but the feeling in the air was thick, like something had just been there, watching me. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure: something wasn't right in that apartment. I spent the next few nights researching the history of the building. There wasn't much to find. No stories of murders or deaths, just the usual records of tenants coming and going. But then I found something in a small article buried in an old newspaper from the 1970s. It mentioned an incident where a tenant had gone missing, a young woman named Caroline Matthews, who had lived in the apartment I now occupied. She was never found, and the case was eventually closed, though rumors of strange happenings in the building persisted. The article gave me chills. I couldn't help but wonder if her spirit was somehow trapped in the apartment, tormenting those who came after her. That night, I decided to confront Mrs. Williams. I had to know more. I knocked on her door again, and when she opened it, I wasted no time. "What happened to Caroline Matthews?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mrs. Williams' face grew pale, and she stepped back, her hand clutching the doorframe as if trying to keep herself steady. "You shouldn't ask about that," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not something you need to know. Just forget about it." But I couldn't forget. I pressed her again, demanding answers, but she refused to say more. "You don't know what you're asking," she whispered. "You don't know what's been unleashed." I left her apartment that night, more terrified than ever. The next few days were a blur of fear and uncertainty. The noises grew louder, the scratching, the whispers, and the heavy footsteps in the hallway, and the dreams. The dreams became worse, more vivid. I would wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air, only to find that I wasn't alone. One night, the door to my bedroom opened by itself. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things, grabbed what I could, and left. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. To this day, I don't know what happened in that building, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was real, and I'm never going back. Story, the end.
Story number 13.
I had lived in my apartment for nearly a year before things started happening. At first, it was easy to ignore the little things. The faint creaks of the floorboards beneath my feet, the occasional tapping of pipes, the way the walls seemed to groan as the building settled at night. Those were the sounds of an old building, I thought. It was a small one-bedroom unit on the second floor of a 3-story building, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, far enough from the city's heart that it felt almost like a little sanctuary. I loved it. I had a peaceful routine, and I rarely had any reason to complain. The building itself was old, probably a century or more, but well kept. The walls had that thin layer of age that made the apartment feel lived in, full of history. But I didn't mind that. It made it feel cozy and homely, even if the floors creaked and the windows didn't always close all the way. The landlord, an older man named Mr. Grant, was friendly but a little eccentric. He lived on the first floor and often stopped by to check on things or to have a quick chat with the tenants. Most of the time, I liked him, but there were moments when his presence made me feel a little uneasy. He had this strange habit of pausing, almost like he was waiting for something before leaving, as though expecting me to say something, or like he wanted me to ask him about the history of the place. But I never did. I didn't want to know. The building had 4 other units besides mine, 2 on the first floor, 1 on the second, and 1 on the third. I rarely saw anyone other than Mr. Grant. The tenant in the other unit on my floor, an older woman named Mrs. Lacey, was quiet and kept mostly to herself, though she would wave when we passed in the hallway. The third floor tenants were young professionals who were hardly ever home, so for the most part, I was left alone. I didn't mind that. I valued my privacy. It started around the middle of my second month in the apartment. At first, I thought it was just a draft. I would hear a soft tapping on my bedroom window during the night. I lived on the side of the building that faced the alley, so I couldn't imagine who would be outside at that time of night tapping on my window. The sound wasn't loud, just enough to wake me up. I'd get up to check, but there was never anything there. No person, no animal, no movement of any kind. I'd shrug it off, tell myself it was the wind, or maybe the trees brushing against the window. But it happened again the next night. And then, again the night after that. It wasn't just the tapping either. It was the sense of being watched. I couldn't shake it. It felt like someone was standing just behind me when I was in the kitchen or sitting in my living room, as if their eyes were boring into my back, waiting for me to turn around. And sometimes I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, just a flash, a shadow darting across the wall. But when I looked, there was never anything there. It was starting to wear on me, but I still dismissed it, convinced that I was just imagining things. Then, one night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. It was around midnight. I had just finished a late dinner and was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone. The apartment was quiet, except for the usual sounds, the hum of the fridge, the occasional creak of the old building. But then, something different happened. I heard a soft scratching noise, faint but unmistakable, coming from the wall behind the couch. It wasn't the kind of noise you expect from an old building. It was more deliberate, slow, rhythmic, like something was dragging its nails against the plaster. I froze, holding my breath. The noise continued. It wasn't random. It was as though whatever was making the noise was trying to communicate. I stood up slowly, walking toward the wall. The scratching stopped when I moved closer, but I swear I could still feel something on the other side of the wall. Something watching me. I touched the wall with my hand, and it was cold. I couldn't explain why, but it felt wrong, like there was something inside the wall. I didn't know what to think. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my instincts told me to get out of there, but I couldn't. I was frozen. And then, before I could even react, the noise came back, louder this time, almost frantic, like something was trying to escape. I backed away from the wall, my mind racing. I checked the window to see if someone was outside, but there was nothing. The alley was empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. I grabbed my phone, but when I went to call someone, I realized that I couldn't. I didn't want to seem crazy. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, turning on all the lights, trying to convince myself that it was just a bad dream. But it didn't stop. The scratching continued, faint but persistent, as if the thing behind the wall was trying to get my attention. I eventually fell asleep, though I'm not sure how. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The apartment felt different. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt colder, like the air had been drained of warmth, and there was a heaviness to the place, like it was waiting for something. I didn't want to stay there another night, but I had nowhere else to go. So I tried to push it all out of my mind, convincing myself it was just stress or sleep deprivation. But then it happened again. That night, I was sitting in bed, reading a book. I had turned off all the lights except for the one on my nightstand, trying to make the room feel more comforting. I heard the scratching again, this time louder, almost frantic. But this time, it wasn't just on the wall. It was coming from inside the walls, as if something was moving around in the space between the rooms. The noise wasn't random. It was deliberate, as if whatever was making the sound was trying to get my attention. I jumped out of bed and went to the window, opening it wide. I looked out into the alley below, half expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. The alley was as quiet and empty as it had been the night before. That's when I saw it. A shadow, moving across the opposite side of the alley like something or someone was walking just beyond my line of sight. I didn't know why, but I felt a surge of terror. I tried to focus on the shape, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I slammed the window shut, my heart racing. I turned to look back at the wall, and that's when I saw it. A faint impression in the wall, like something was pushing from the other side. It wasn't visible at first, but as I stared, it began to take shape. A dark, jagged line, almost like a crack forming in the plaster. I could feel the temperature in the room drop, and the air grew thick and heavy. The scratching intensified, louder and more frantic. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called Mr. Grant. He picked up on the first ring, his voice groggy. "Hello?" "Mr. Grant," I said, my voice trembling. "There's something wrong with the apartment. Something's in the walls. I don't know what it is, but I can't take it anymore. Please, you have to help me." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "You should have never come here," he said, his voice low. I've been trying to warn people, but they don't listen. It's not just the building. There's something else, something old." I didn't understand. "What do you mean? What's going on?" "You need to leave now," he said urgently. "Get out of the apartment. Don't look back. The building has a way of trapping people. It doesn't let go. It never lets go." Before I could ask another question, the line went dead. I didn't wait to figure out what was going on. I grabbed my things, shoved them into a bag, and ran out of the apartment. I don't know how long I was gone, but I didn't go back. I couldn't. To this day, I haven't set foot in that building again. I moved to a new apartment in a different part of the city, one that I thought would be safe from whatever had happened in that old building. But every now and then, I still hear the scratching, the tapping in the walls. It follows me wherever I go, even when I try to ignore it. Sometimes, when the lights flicker and the air grows heavy, I feel it. Whatever was in that building, still watching, still waiting. Story, the end.